JLF's Brave New World welcomes you back to our second episode of the day. Those of you who missed our earlier session, Bhay or Bhairav, Negotiating Fear, Devdutt Patnaik in conversation with Meru Gokhale, and our many other sessions featuring Andrew Sean Greer, Anna Chandy, Shelja Sen, Vikram Chandra, John Ralston Saul, and so many others. You can watch these on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM Bajate Raho. Our next session today is Are We All in This Together? Jairam Ramesh and Marcus Moench in conversation. At a time when the human species confronts a pandemic, the planet faces the challenges posed by a warming Earth. How do we address the disproportionate impact of climate change on the poor and societies that have benefited least from the carbon economy? Economist, politician, and environmentalist Jairam Ramesh and climate, water, and environmental expert Marcus Moench discuss governmental and institutional responses to the implications of these linked crises and ask if and how we can survive and thrive together. Jairam Ramesh is a Member of Parliament and Chairman of the Standing Committee on Science and Technology, Environment, Forests, and Climate Change. He's the author of several well-known books, including Making Sense of Chin India, Green Signals, Ecology, Growth, and Democracy in India, To the Brink and Back, India's 1991 Story, Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature, and Intertwined Lives, P.N. Huxer and Indira Gandhi. His latest book is A Checkered Brilliance, The Many Lives of V.K. Krishna Menon, which is a bestseller. Marcus Moench works on water, climate, and social change issues in South Asia, the United States, and globally, combining narratives of transformation and resilience in complex socio-ecological systems. His work spans culture, art, and science in pursuit of change. He founded the Institute for Social and Environmental Transition in 1997. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section below. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And of course, if we drop off, just hang in there. We'll be right back on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, are we all in this together? Jairam Ramesh and Marcus Moench in conversation. Over to you, gentlemen.
Well, I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's a pleasure to see Jairam, Ramesh, and all the others as well on this. You know, are we in this together? I mean, I think as a zero starting point, the answer is obviously yes and no. We're in it together in the sense that we're highly interconnected. Pandemics, climate change don't really respect walls, don't really respect borders. Don't really respect, fully at least, economic differentials. But at the same time, we have tremendous differences. And as Sanjoy pointed out at the beginning, it's often the poor who are most affected. It's sometimes the wealthy who you would think would be prepared and able to respond who are affected as well in very different ways. And I think the U.S.'s experience in the pandemic is a case in point, where the current situation highlights divisions that have been deeper and have perhaps been papered over by wealth. So as a starting point, I think one of the big questions is not just, are we in this together, but what might make us in this more together, and what are the sources of division and that sort of thing that could really exacerbate or perhaps mitigate the longer term challenges of climate, as well as the immediate impacts of the pandemic and so on. So Jairam, as a question for you, what do you think, do we have as cultures pre-existing conditions that predispose us to equity or inequity and conflict under stress? That to me is perhaps a starting question that would lead into this bigger question.
Well, Marcus, it's very clear. Our experience over the last 4 months has demonstrated once again, if it needed to be demonstrated, that there is a social dimension to health. There are social determinants of health. that health outcomes are not only a function of investment in the health sector or health technology sector or health science sector or the pharmaceutical sector, but there are social determinants, and those social determinants relate to class, they relate to access, to basic services, income differentials. So I think, we must recognize the social determinants of health, and secondly, the point that you made right at the beginning, that this pandemic is not merely a public health crisis. It actually is fundamentally an ecological crisis. This is a zoonotic pandemic. Most pandemics have been zoonotic in recent times. This is a zoonotic pandemic. It's not going to be the last of them all. And unless we recognize the environmental dimension of what we are going through, we will treat this, through a vaccine, through a drug, through social distancing, but it will not address the root cause. And the root cause, as you have pointed out, is the way we manage the environment, of which global warming is, one manifestation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole zoonotic element is absolutely central in the pandemic and has some very tangible links to core environmental issues. The example in the United States, I mean, the Native American communities, for example, are particularly hard hit. And it's a question often of access to water and services, the ability to do hand washing, the ability to control cleanliness, things like that. And that takes us back to a global differential. If you look at, for example, India, I think the rough calculation is India has 4% of the global water resources, yet 18% of the world's population. The United States has something like 4.3% of the world's population, and yet about 8% of the world's water resources. So as an inherent differentiation, we have access to a huge amount more of the basic resources, the basic water availability on a per capita basis. But at the same time, we have this inherent inequity or huge inequity in access to them that is heavily along social lines. And so, we have this interplay between the basic resource availability and the social system.
Unfortunately, in all our international discussions, and I've been part of global climate change negotiations for years, equity across nations does not form part of the equation. We pay lip service to it, but for example, the Paris Agreement. The only equitable part of the Paris Agreement is that every country has made national commitments bottom up. It's not been a top-down commitment that has been given out to every country based on its stage of development, like the Kyoto Protocol was. Equity is a very important issue. It's an issue across nations, but Marcus, it's also an issue within nations. I mean, you look at the consumption differentials within India. They are as startling as the differentials in consumption between India and the United States. The United States consumes per capita 13 times the amount of electricity an Indian consumes. But if you look at the pattern of electricity consumption within India, you will find similar, startling discrepancies. So I think you're right. The equity issue, particularly when it relates to consumption, because it is consumption that is driving this crisis, this pandemic. And I think governments have to be more concerned about it. Right now, of course, all governments are worried about survival and revival. But I hope that when we go over the survival hump, we do not revive to go back to the old model of consumption, that we revive to a more equitable and a more humane way of economic growth. Because, this mindless pursuit of GDP growth is a recipe for disaster. I mean, it's just absolute recipe for disaster. The Chinese followed the American model. The Brazilians followed the American model. Now, if India were to follow it, I think we're going to have just, chaos, not only in the world, but within India. So I think we need to get out of this grow now, pay later model. That we'll grow for 20 years and we'll accumulate all the costs of that growth and we'll deal with it 20 years down the road when our per capita income is, say, $10,000 or something like that. So this is a historic opportunity for countries like India because we are at $2,000 per capita. We are a low middle income country, and if we go the same route that the Chinese have gone, or an Americans had gone in an earlier generation, we are going to add to the global crisis.
Right. I mean, and this, to me, this really comes back to that question of, what could make us more in this together? And the critical challenge is our current trajectories are clearly unsustainable.
Absolutely.
Whether you take it on a population basis, whether you take it on a resource basis, whether you take it on a long-term sort of social division, political stability basis. But the question that has been raised many, many times, the question is, on one level, what is the economic kind of foundations? What are the alternative foundations that could be different from the consumption model? But that would also help us bridge some of these you might call them cultural, tribal, racial, equity, other divisions. I think in the States, one of the things that has actually given me a lot of hope recently is the Black Lives Matter movement, which is really, for the first time, pulling out groups across the racial spectrum to recognize that here is a fundamental differential. That doesn't get to the equity, the economic model that might get us forward. If you look at historical societies, it wasn't necessarily about consumption. People got identity through cultural things. The Native American societies had a lot of that, where it was a few months a year to provide basic necessities. And I think the globe is probably at a situation now where a few months of work a year could meet most people's necessities. But the question is, we don't have the cultural foundations right now or the economic models right now that would allow us to realize that and give meaning, income, livelihoods to people in a different one.
Well, we have only one economic model, Marcus, and that's a consumption-intensive, resource-intensive, energy-intensive model. And countries have to decouple. They have to decouple energy and growth. They have to decouple pollution and growth. Now, countries like the US will find it difficult because you're locked into a pattern of consumption. But countries like China, countries like India will find it easier because, we are still not at that level of development as the European or the American economies are. And so I think there is a historic opportunity for the developing world to go away from this grow now, pay later syndrome, this consumption syndrome. I'm not advocating austerity by any means. I'm not saying I should have all the consumption and the other person should not have that consumption. However, I think the choices that need to be made, public systems of transport versus private modes of transport, renewable sources of energy over fossil fuel sources of energy, a pattern of habitation that stresses green buildings over energy intensive buildings, more climate friendly methods of cooling. These are all choices that we have to make. And I think that's these choices, I hope right now we can only talk about it, but I think once the worst is over And once countries begin to retool and regroup, these are some of the choices that have to be made. Now, what will drive these choices? This is the question that you asked. What will trigger them? Unfortunately, what is being shaken is the international institutional infrastructure. I think international institutions are absolutely crucial for this, whether it's in environment, whether it's in health, whether it's in trade. You need international rules of the game. You need international engagement. Uh, Disengagement is not the way of stopping pandemics.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
You have to engage. You will have more intensive engagement. The modes of engagement might change. But what bothers me the most, Marcus, is the extreme suspicion of international institutions in the United States. And I think this is not helpful to the international community. Now, in November 2020, the United States will legally get out of the Paris Agreement. I mean, this is on the cards. So it all depends what happens to the election. But nevertheless, as of now, the United States is on track for withdrawing from the Paris Agreement in November 2020. Now, look at what has happened at the WHO. I think international institutions have to be reformed. They have to be made more professional. They have to be made less bureaucratic, less political. But the answer is not to walk away from international institutions.
Yeah. I mean, I fully agree with the point of international institutions as being absolutely fundamental. And I do think, if you look at the short-term question of do we have the same leadership in the United States that is currently walking away from the international organizations, we are hoping for a change in that, or at least I'm certainly hoping for a fundamental change in that, getting rid of Trump and having another administration in there. But I think that the question of where the threat to international organizations come is much more deeply rooted in belief systems and questions of belief in science, belief in cooperation, and your overall identity. And as an example is, here I have my pandemic scarf to walk around with to breathe. I have a friend yesterday was talking about their experience in a local jewelry shop where a person came in and absolutely refused to wear a mask until the point where police had to be called. So there's this deep division, suspicion, where wearing a mask is sort of a symbol of not a question of health. It's a question of political belief. Do you believe the systems? Do you do it? And I think that ripples right on up. And where we're playing games, it's not just the US, it's other places, and where you see this fundamental difference in governance. In Germany, there's a belief in those systems, and somebody like Merkel is able to get a population to, despite a lot of opposition, to behave in ways that begin to reflect the larger society. In the States, we have these incredibly intense divisions. And in India, you have similar mix.
On this, I have to say, Marcus, that India is more like Germany than the United States, mercifully. Today, after 108 days, I attended a parliamentary committee meeting, and everybody had a glove, everybody had a mask, and we maintained the physical distancing norms. It was, we were discussing the corona crisis and our responses to it. And so we didn't have anybody saying, I'm not going to wear a mask, I'm not going to follow the rule. This is a threat to my freedom. This is a threat to my constitutional rights. So in that way, I think India is fortunately, in fact, it's remarkable. Kerala has got international headlines, for the way it has managed the COVID pandemic. But
Yeah, I've heard
I
that.
think the greatest success story in India is not so much Kerala, which was expected, but the greatest success story in India must be Dharavi, which is the world's biggest slum in the middle of Bombay. And look at the infection rates in Dharavi compared to other parts of Bombay, which proves the point that I was making and which you were also started off with, which is that there is a social dimension to health. There are social determinants of health. There are community determinants of health. And Dharavi, which is not written about that much, when the history of these times will be written, it will show that in the bang in the middle of Bombay, here was one of the world's biggest slums, highly densely populated, which did not have the infection rates of some of the other parts, of the metropolis. So that way, we are a little better positioned than the US, in terms of adherence to norms, adherence to regulations and rules. This is as much a crisis of psychological behavior as much as it is about vaccines and drugs, is it not? So
Yes.
there
Well,
we are slightly better off.
yeah. I mean, my notes before the talk here were really that the psychology of tribalism, the psychology of belief, the psychology of scales. That this is really a central issue. And I think that goes back to the psychology of consumption,
Yeah.
And how you maintain identity. If you take it back to that question of climate change and the global impact on resources, and draw the parallels between this and between the climate change issues and the pandemic, I think that the pandemic has highlighted in some ways where the kind of standard norms of saying this is going to be purely the poor who are affected or purely the wealthy, it really comes back to governance, and governance comes back to its foundations in belief and cultural systems and the question of that. And so, to me, one of the hardest nuts to crack is actually the social science
Yes, absolutely.
of the transition.
Well, absolutely. I don't want to give the impression that only the US, had these cleavages and India didn't. In fact, in the initial 2-3 months, the biggest issue in India was that of migrant workers,
Right.
domestic migrant workers. And there was a clear class dimension there. The Indian government was sending out planes to evacuate Indians stranded abroad. They were bringing back foreign students. But we were not able to move migrant labor from one state to another. So that was a clear class dimension there. The class character of the Indian state became very obvious and very, very apparent when we were with alacrity wanting to send planes abroad to bring back Indians, relatively better off, rather than spend time trying to help migrants move from their place of work back to their place of residence. And even today, that remains a huge crisis. 1 out of every 3 Indians is a migrant, and migrant labor in India is the locomotive for many regional economies, whether it's in the northern part or the western part or the southern part. And in fact, it's been a very, to my mind, that's been the most depressing aspect of this crisis, is the manner in which the Indian state and Indian society reacted to the crisis of migrant labor.
Right.
And now,
And that interestingly enough, you could say exactly the same thing for the United States. The whole question of migrant there, in our case, it may have been more international
yes,
migrants, but we have.
Ours was more domestic. I was talking.
Yours was more domestic. So there's a one of those administrative borders that is a difference.
Yeah.
But the reality is, in your case, tremendous numbers of migrants trying to get home with very little support. We get, of course, the stories of people walking 700 kilometers or whatever to return to their place, their home place. And then the question of what happens to the economies that are dependent on the migrants in places like India. But we have exactly the same here, where the question of tremendous numbers of migrants whose livelihoods depend on harvesting, on work in meat packing plants, on work in all sorts of labor situations. And we're only beginning to see, we're seeing huge impacts in terms of the equity on people who are unable to access that work. And we may well see the impact on the economy, on access to questions of vegetables, fruits, etc., all those jobs that go unfilled. As a
in fact, there are many parts in India who don't want the migrants to come back. And that's going to create further social problems and economic tensions. So, I mean, the whole issue of migrant labor, the way we have addressed it, shows the point that you're making, that there are class issues, there are issues of economic differentials, inequalities, and I mean the fact that the entire Indian system got exercised over Indian tourists stranded abroad,
right,
and were not bothered about literally millions, Marcus, literally millions of, over 20-30 million workers we are talking about, going from the northern part, eastern part, and southern part back to their homes in the eastern part of the country. And even today, there is enormous amount of dislocation. Livelihoods have been destroyed. We are talking of livelihoods being destroyed, not
completely.
jobs being lost. These are livelihoods being destroyed. So I think we have yet to grapple with. I mean, as far as we are concerned, this year is a complete write-off as far as growth is concerned. So we have to really begin a new chapter in 2021.
Right.
And I hope that chapter, we will not repeat the consumption, resource intensive, energy intensive type of a model, suburban intensive. It's also, by the way, Marcus, the way we urbanize.
Right.
Do we urbanize horizontally like the United States has done, or do we urbanize vertically, where land is a constraint and where energy is a constraint? Now, these are choices that we have to make, and I hope that ultimately comes back to governance. Is the type of issues that we have to raise.
And I mean, I think that what that highlights is, though we have very different experiences in the pandemic and different scales of population, things like that, there are also tremendous parallels, in terms of where we face very similar issues, despite our quite differences in wealth and in political things and that sort of thing. But, if one was to take it back and say, the pandemic has provided a pause.
Yeah.
When we look at the global situation, we see the fragmentation of the global institutions. We also see some bright spots. I mean, solar and wind are now less expensive than traditional fossil fuels. So there are some real bright spots of places where getting a shift in the economy is actually happening, and is happening in conservative as well as more liberally oriented places. So the question, if you were to put 3 priorities on things as lessons out of the pandemic for climate, what would they be?
I think solar would certainly be top of the list. The solar prices have come crashing down. When I was minister in 2010, solar prices were 20 rupees a unit. Today, we are opening bids at 2.5 rupees, less than 3 rupees a unit. So solar prices have come crashing down. And solar has become competitive, more than competitive, with fossil fuels. The problem is we do not have a revolution in energy storage as yet. I mean,
Right.
the day we have a battery, like the mobile phone telephony revolution that we had, if we had a revolution in storage, then solar will become a far more reliable source of electricity. But Germany, Marcus, is a good example. A third of Germany's electricity supply today comes from solar, and solar. The structure of electricity generation has changed completely. There are 8 million Germans today in a nation of 80 million who are who have become energy producers, not
Right.
just energy consumers. So, top of the list would be solar. I think the solar revolution is ripe. I think countries will certainly reap the benefits of rapidly declining costs. Second, forests. I think we should not forget that this is a long-term game that we are playing. Solar will give you immediate benefits, but reforestation, natural regeneration of forests where they have been decimated or destroyed, these are valuable carbon sinks, and they are going to add to the planet's capacity, to be resilient in the face of global warming. So, solar, number one, massive afforestation and regeneration of forests where they have been lost is certainly a second item that I would put on top of the priority. Third, I would say transport. I would
Mhm.
I would put huge amounts of money in public transport, because this private transport model of economic growth, where we are just adding to the population of cars and adding to the burden of pollution, is simply
Right.
not sustainable. So,
Right.
you ask me three priorities, I would say solar, forests, and public transport.
Okay, and lying behind those is perhaps your other. Just before we go to questions, is perhaps your other priority that you brought up. None of those would happen without a global architecture
Yes,
and global institutions.
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
so, as a priority in there, let's get some of the frameworks right where we can have more content-based discussions, less disingenuous discussions, more substantive agreement on how we move forward. So I have a couple of questions that have come up from the audience. The first one is Ariane, who's asked, what environmental regulation should we lobby the government for to introduce first after the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, we are in India, unfortunately, we are the government is in the business of environmental deregulation, not environmental regulation,
Yes.
because it looks upon environment as a burden, uh,
Welcome to the club.
not as an obligation. So
Yes,
we are
that's the same
fighting.
here.
We are fighting to save forests. We are fighting to save our coastal areas. We are fighting to, ensure that our laws are enforced. India, for example, has very progressive environmental laws, very
Right.
progressive environmental regulations, but their enforcement has left a lot to be desired. And my fear, Marcus, which I have been expressing, is that the government, in its desire to kickstart the economy, is going to loosen these environmental regulations as a way of saying, okay, we are creating an climate hospitable for investment, and I think that's really the recipe for disaster.
Right. And we have a very parallel situation. We just had a judge rule against the Dakota Access Pipeline and saying it has to be emptied.
Well,
But then the company saying we're going to ignore the judge's order. So,
recently we've had our prime minister, compare coal with a diamond. Can you
yeah,
imagine in 2020 a political leader actually saying coal is like a diamond? I mean, this is the language of the 1970s or the
right.
80s, but certainly not of the
So
21st century.
let me grab another question. Just one, and I'm apologize. There are so many questions coming in. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. But Rohit is asking, the transition to renewable resources of energy, is that slowed because of the low oil prices and need to get economies up and running? Or is there something that's fast possible after the COVID-19 related?
I think the transition is slow because of energy storage. Because remember that today, even if you put 1 gigawatt of solar capacity, you still require 1 gigawatt of base load, which usually is either gas or coal or nuclear. So it's really a technological problem. The fact that solar, is only about 20% in terms of energy production. You can have all the great capacity, but the question is how much energy that you're producing. So I'm afraid until we have a big bang mobile phone type of a revolution in storage, uh, we are not going to have a huge jump in renewables. The other lesson that we learned from Germany, Marcus, is that we need regional electricity grids. Now, Germany is actually buying power from France, and 70% of France's electricity comes from nuclear power. So, they have integrated a nuclear grid with a renewable grid. So it's not just devices, but it's re-architecturing of the entire grid that we need to do.
Yes, we face tremendous resistance on the re-architecture because it's designed as a regional grid, which blocks then a lot of local generation. So that contravenes our regulations. So we only have 5 minutes left here. There was a very interesting question on the narrative of Dharavi. What is the advocacy of elevated levels of social responsibility among its inhabitants and adequate health services in this dense human jungle? And this to me, here is a case where one of the places that you would say would be the most effective and highly inequitable, but is actually coming through well, might contain lessons that could be important globally.
No, the lesson there, Marcus, Kerala is a good example of state intervention. Dharavi is a good example of community intervention. The state does not exist in Dharavi.
Right.
It's the community that took the responsibility. And I'm really amazed, and how Dharavi is actually turned out. I'm really amazed, and I think a lot of it has to do with community tracking. A lot of it has to do with community surveillance. A lot of it has to do with community interventions. The fact is that the state does not exist in Dharavi, because if the state existed, then the facilities in Dharavi would not be as abysmal as they are at the present moment.
Right. So there's a belief and a community element that really supports interaction. And there's this contrast between a government level at Kerala and a community level. And if you put that, I think Sarah Ahmed is asking, do we need a new international order? Is it a very similar tension where we need to get communities engaged at levels, but we also need an international order parallel to what Kerala has done that actually reflects that and enables
absolutely. You need local and global. You need local interventions. You need local, policies, but you need global architectures. The global should strengthen the local, and the local should feed into the global. So these are not, I don't see them as either or propositions. You need global institutions, you need global frameworks, you need global cooperation, but ultimately, local community interventions, particularly in areas like health and environment, but even in environment, even in terms of climate resilience, you can have the Paris Agreement, Marcus, but it will be local communities who will determine how resilient local they are to the vagaries of climate change.
Right. And is Dharavi based as well upon the fact that there's an acceptance of a belief system that this is real?
I think there was a lot of social capital, Marcus.
Right.
Social capital was very, very important. And I think what the US is seeing is a collapse of social capital, and
or a division, stirring up a divisions,
or social divisiveness. And I think Dharavi was a very good example in which the social capital actually worked towards a collective outcome. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of what Dharavi has been able to achieve, because I was looking at some of the figures of Dharavi, to other communities in Bombay, you know,
Right.
and within Bombay, Dharavi has a lower infection rate, which is quite remarkable.
Right. So the pandemic has really put a big question mark around elements of the narrative around climate change, in the sense saying just that it's the poor who will be most affected. For example, in a gross sense, perhaps yes, but at the same time, there are places where innovation, community, etc., can really flip that. And if you put it and said the wealthy would be the least affected, well, our fragmented government system here means that
Absolutely.
despite tremendous wealth,
If
huge
you're
amounts of
looking
resources
at,
going into
if you're talking about water management, which you raised, if you're talking
right,
of managing local common property resources, managing forests, managing land, these are all local interventions, Marcus. You can
yeah,
have global rules, you can have global institutions, but ultimately it's the local management of water, the distribution of water, the local management of forest resources that is going to determine outcomes for families. So I think it's this, it's the strengthening of local institutions, whether it's local urban bodies or whether it's local rural institutions of self-government. Very, very important.
right.
Absolutely.
And so, without raising his question, I mean, Subir had asked, is there a solution for water scarcity? And I think you've addressed it fairly
Well,
well.
distribution is very important.
Yeah,
More equitable distribution of the water resources that we have. I know there are people who look upon desalination as a long-term answer, but that's a technological fix. And one of the lessons that we learn is technological fixes. In the long run, they don't work out. They may give you short-term, benefits. So ultimately, you have to look at the distribution of water resource. How you
yeah. And if you,
equitably, and the way
yeah,
you
if you go
manage
to that, if you go
it.
to that, you just reiterate the old growth model, that if you go to desalinization, it's water flows uphill towards money,
Yeah.
because desalinization is tremendously expensive, technology intensive, and it will flow up towards money.
But
So it
we're
won't
going back
address
to
that
an
basic.
energy intensive model, isn't it? I mean, if
Yeah,
you talk of desalination, you're going back to, unless you have massive solar based desalination plants, that's something that could work in future. But right now, I would rather spend my money and my time on water distribution, reducing water distribution losses, managing, improving the efficiency of water management. I mean, that will give you better payoffs than these massive investments in desalinization.
right. So, I think we're out of time, but just to wrap up, it's really, there's a tremendous emphasis on what can be done at a community level, because there's a core basis for that hits at some of the psychology, the belief, as well as the tangible management. Those things also need to be supported by a national, state level, and international architecture, and that a tremendous focus on rebuilding those post pandemic is going to be a huge lesson out of this that could apply and help us address the questions of climate, the larger things that are continuing.
Well, governance architectures both within countries and across countries. I think
Yeah,
that's the bottom line. That's the bottom line lesson that we learn. And I hope that every country looks at governance architectures both within the country, just as we look at governance architectures across countries.
right. I totally agree on that. So I think at this point, I turn it back over to Sanjoy. I believe we're out of time here.
Thanks so much, Marcus. Thank you, Jairam. That was just fascinating. And the need to build local systems, I think that's key. And of course, the 3 points that you brought up, which was look at solar energy, look at reforesting our entire systems, and of course, water and public transport. More importantly, perhaps when we come back in September and we'll ask you both to come back, really look at the need for international institutions to step up to the table. And the
Absolutely.
need at this moment is really not, as you said, to leave that table, but really get everybody around that table to be able to look at what is possible. You both were just amazing. I'm sorry that we couldn't take all the questions that you posed to Marcus Moench and Jairam Ramesh. Perhaps if you want to just send it in, Neha will send it to both of them and type out their replies for you all on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you to our radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho. And remember to be back with us on Saturday, 11th of July, that's tomorrow. We open with the ocean of geopolitics, Sanjeev Sanyal in conversation with Vikram Chandra, economist, urban theorist, and historian Sanjeev Sanyal, and journalist Vikram Chandra navigate us across the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean through the past and present, seeking perspectives through the lens of geopolitics. They speak of the key trade routes for seaborne cargo and the maritime leverage that is attached to them, especially in these conflicted times. And this is at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And the second session tomorrow, Saturday the 11th, is If All the World and Love Were Young, Stephen Sexton in conversation with Elaine Canning, a session that uncovers the core of poetic inspiration. Stephen Sexton, in discussion with Elaine Canning, explores his acclaimed debut poetry collection, If All the World and Love Were Young. Love loss, memory, childhood, imagination, and grief, Sexton's verse conveys the anguish of a mother's death through the levels of the classic video game Super Mario World. And this is at 8:30 p.m. IST, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Stay safe. See you tomorrow. We promise to have Marcus back with Jairam Ramesh, perhaps for JLF at Boulder or America season in September. See you. Take care.
Thank you.